There is a dangerous kind of silence that falls over a boardroom when a man realizes his entire life is a lie. Carter Wells sat at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting his $10,000 Rolex, ready to close a $200 million real estate deal that would make him a senior partner. The double oak doors opened, but it wasn't the CEO of the investment group who walked in. It was his wife, the same woman he had called embarrassing and chased out of their penthouse just 3 weeks ago. Only now she was flanked by security, wearing a custom-tailored suit, and the billionaires in the room were bowing their heads to her. Carter Wells was a man who built his life the way he built his commercial skyscrapers, with a flashy exterior designed to impress, obscuring a foundation that was desperately insecure. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in South Boston, Carter had spent his entire childhood pressing his nose against the glass of the wealthy elite. He learned early on that in America, perception was reality. If you wore the right suit, drove the right car, and spoke with the right clipped, confident cadence, people assumed you belonged. By the time he was 32, he had clawed his way up to a director position at Harrison & Gable, one of Chicago's most ruthless and prestigious commercial real estate firms. He was tall, white, classically handsome, with sharp jawlines and meticulously styled hair. He was a shark in a tailored Italian suit. Naya was the exact opposite. They met on a rainy Tuesday in a small, independent coffee shop off the Magnificent Mile. Carter had ducked in to take a client call, irritated by the weather threatening his suede loafers. Naya was sitting in a worn leather armchair, deeply engrossed in a dense novel, a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her. When a clumsy barista knocked over a tray, splashing hot water onto Carter's briefcase, he had erupted, his temper flaring as he began to berate the terrified teenager. Nia had quietly stood up, handed the barista a napkin, and turned to Carter. "The leather is waterproof. The boy's dignity is not. Take a breath." Her voice was like warm honey, calm but laced with an absolute, unshakable authority. Carter had been stunned into silence. He looked at her properly for the first time. She was a stunning black woman with deep, luminous skin, her hair pulled back into a simple, elegant bun. She wore a plain beige knit sweater and dark jeans. There were no visible logos on her clothing, no flashy jewelry, just an aura of complete self-assurance that Carter found intoxicating. He apologized to the barista, and then, surprisingly, he introduced himself to her. She introduced herself as Nia Banks. What Carter didn't know, what he wouldn't know until it was far too late, was that Banks was her mother's maiden name. Her real name was Nia Sterling. She was the youngest daughter of Arthur Sterling, the reclusive patriarch of the Sterling Group, a private global conglomerate with holdings in international shipping, luxury real estate, and tech infrastructure. The Sterlings were old money, the kind of wealth that didn't flash its name on the sides of buildings, but owned the land the buildings sat on. Nia had grown up in a world of private jets, Swiss boarding schools, and security details, but she possessed her late mother's empathetic heart. Exhausted by the sycophants and fortune hunters that swarmed her family, she had moved to Chicago under an alias to run a non-profit youth literacy program. She wanted to know who she was without her family's billions. She wanted to be loved for herself. For the first 2 years, their relationship was idyllic. Carter was charmed by Nia's grounding presence. Whenever the stress of his cutthroat corporate world became too much, he would retreat to her modest 2-bedroom apartment in Hyde Park. Nia was his sanctuary. She listened to his rants about office politics, cooked him dinners, and reminded him that there was more to life than the corner office. She loved his ambition, believing it came from a place of passion rather than a desperate need for validation. When Carter proposed on the steps of the Art Institute of Chicago, Nia wept tears of genuine joy. She said yes, believing she had found a man who loved the simple, unassuming woman she presented herself to be. They had a modest wedding. Nia claimed her parents were deceased and her extended family was estranged, a lie that broke her heart to tell, but one she felt was necessary to protect her peace. Only her older brother, Arthur Jr., attended, posing as a distant cousin named Artie, who ran a hardware store. Carter barely spoke to him, dismissing him after 5 minutes to go network with his firm's partners who had attended the reception. It was the first crack in the foundation. Carter didn't just want a wife, he wanted an asset. And as he began his aggressive ascent up the corporate ladder, he began to realize that the quiet, unassuming woman he married was not the flashy accessory he felt his new status demanded. By their 3rd anniversary, Carter's life had fundamentally shifted. He had secured a massive promotion to senior director, effectively making him the right-hand man to the firm's ruthless CEO, Richard Gable. With the promotion came a massive influx of cash and a sudden plunge into Chicago's ultra-elite social scene. Carter moved them out of Nia's comfortable apartment and into a sterile, ultra-modern penthouse in the Loop, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass. He traded his mid-range sedan for a Porsche. He began spending thousands of dollars on bespoke suits and luxury watches. He was building his armor. But as Carter's exterior became more polished, his gaze toward his wife became highly critical. The wives of Carter's new colleagues were a specific breed. They were mostly former models or socialites, women who spent their days at Pilates, managing interior decorators, and organizing extravagant charity galas. They wore head-to-toe designer labels, sported massive diamond tennis bracelets, and engaged in a relentless, passive-aggressive competition of social dominance. Nia had zero interest in this world. She had grown up surrounded by billionaires and found the frantic, performative wealth of Carter's new circle exhausting and transparent. She continued to run her non-profit, waking up early to ride the train to the South Side. She continued to wear her comfortable, well-made but unbranded clothing. She preferred reading a book over attending a champagne brunch. At first, Carter tried to gently nudge her. He would bring home shopping bags from Saks Fifth Avenue or Prada. "Just something I saw that would look great on you for the Reynolds dinner this weekend," he would say, handing her a skin-tight, heavily sequined cocktail dress. Nia would smile politely, thank him, and then wear a classic, tailored vintage black dress she had owned for years. Slowly, the gentle nudges turned into passive-aggressive comments, which eventually devolved into open hostility. Carter began to see Nia's refusal to play the game as a personal insult, a deliberate sabotage of his career. He was terrified that his colleagues would think he wasn't successful enough to keep a glamorous wife. The racial dynamics of their new social circle also began to grate on Nia, compounding the issue. At elite dinners, she was often the only black woman in the room. The other wives would ask her incredibly invasive, microaggressive questions about her hair, or assume she worked for the catering staff before Carter introduced her. Instead of defending his wife, Carter would laugh off the insults to keep the peace with his wealthy associates. "Don't be so sensitive, Nia," he hissed at her in the back of an Uber after a particularly grueling dinner where a partner's wife had asked Nia how she managed to escape the inner city. "Chloe didn't mean anything by it. You just need to try harder to fit in. You're making things awkward." "I am not making things awkward, Carter. Her ignorance is," Nia had replied, her voice dangerously calm. "And I shouldn't have to wear a $3,000 Gucci belt for your friends to treat me with basic human dignity." "It's not about the belt," Carter snapped, running a hand through his hair. "It's about projecting success, I am busting my ass to provide this incredible life for us, and you walk around looking like a substitute teacher. You don't get your nails done. You don't socialize with the wives. Do you know how embarrassing it is when Richard asks what my wife does? And I have to tell him you're teaching kids to read in a basement." The word hit Nia like a physical blow. Embarrassing. She looked at her husband, truly looked at him. The man she had fallen in love with, the man who used to hold her hand in the park and talk about building affordable, sustainable housing, was gone. In his place was a hollow, terrified social climber who measured his worth, and hers, by the brand names stitched into their collars. She turned her head to look out the window at the passing city lights. In her purse, her burner phone vibrated. It was a text from her brother, Arthur Jr. "Dad is finalizing the acquisition of Harrison and Gable's primary lending bank. Are you ready to come home yet, little bird?" Nia typed back, "Not yet." "I need to know for sure." The turning point arrived 2 months later, coinciding with the most important night of Carter's professional life, the Apex Real Estate Awards. Harrison and Gable was up for Firm of the Year, and Carter was personally nominated for Deal Maker of the Year. Winning this award guaranteed a full partnership. For weeks, Carter was a ball of frantic energy. He obsessed over every detail of the evening. On the morning of the gala, he hired a high-end glam squad to come to the penthouse. He had purchased a neon pink, deeply plunging Versace gown that left almost nothing to the imagination, alongside a pair of painfully high, jewel-encrusted stilettos. "Wear this tonight," Carter commanded, dropping the garment bags on their bed. "No arguments, Nia. This is the biggest night of my life. Richard Gable is sitting at our table, and so is William Royce." Nia paused from making her morning tea. "William Royce? The head of the Royce Investment Group?" "Yes," Carter said, his eyes practically gleaming with greed. "He's managing a new multi-billion-dollar urban development fund. If I can get him to sign with our firm, I won't just be a partner, I'll be untouchable. So tonight, you need to look the part. Let the stylist do your hair. Put on the dress. Just be a trophy for one night. For me." Nia stared at the pink dress. It was everything she hated, loud, uncomfortable, and desperate for attention. It wasn't her. More importantly, she knew exactly who William Royce was. He was one of her father's oldest golfing buddies and a board member of the Sterling Group. He had bounced Nia on his knee when she was a toddler. "Carter," Nia said softly, "I will come to support you, but I am not wearing that dress. It's inappropriate and it makes me uncomfortable. I have a perfectly lovely navy silk gown." Carter's face flushed dark red. "A lovely navy gown. Are you going to a funeral or an awards gala? God, Nia, why do you always have to be so difficult? Why can't you just be like Chloe Gable or the others? Why do you insist on looking so plain?" "Because I am not Chloe Gable," Nia replied, her voice dropping an octave, carrying that same unshakable authority she possessed the day they met. "I am your wife. If that is no longer enough for you, you need to tell me." Carter scoffed, grabbing his briefcase. "Just try not to embarrass me tonight. That's all I ask." That evening, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds and bespoke tuxedos. Carter arrived early to network, leaving Nia to arrive in a separate car. When she walked in, heads didn't turn with shock, but they certainly noticed her. She wore her own vintage navy silk gown. It was masterfully tailored, draping elegantly over her frame, paired with simple pearl earrings that had once belonged to her great-grandmother. She looked like royalty, but in a room full of neon, feathers, and ostentatious displays of new wealth, Carter only saw defiance. When he spotted her, He quickly intercepted her before she could reach their table. "I told you to wear the pink," he hissed, his fingers gripping her elbow a little too tightly. "Let go of me, Carter," she said smoothly, smiling for the cameras while prying his hand off. Dinner was a torturous affair. Carter effectively iced Naya out, spending the entire time laughing uproariously at Richard Gable's terrible jokes and pouring expensive champagne for the other wives. Naya sat quietly, picking at her filet mignon, feeling entirely invisible. Then William Royce arrived at their table to pay his respects to Richard Gable. Royce was a distinguished older man with a sharp eye. As Carter jumped up to practically grovel at Royce's feet, introducing himself and pitching his ideas at a rapid-fire pace, Royce's eyes drifted past Carter's shoulder. Royce stopped dead in his tracks. He blinked, staring directly at Naya. Naya offered him a very small, very deliberate nod, placing one finger subtly over her lips. "Don't say my name." Royce, a master of boardroom poker faces, instantly understood. He masked his shock with a polite smile. "And who is this lovely young woman?" Royce asked, looking at Carter. This was Carter's moment to elevate his wife, to introduce her with pride. Instead, Carter gave a dismissive, awkward chuckle. "Oh, that's just Naya. My wife," Carter said, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Don't mind her. She's a bit out of her depth tonight. She runs a little charity project in the slums. You know how it is, Mr. Royce. I bring home the bacon, and she likes to play Mother Teresa. Frankly, I can't take her anywhere without her looking like she's ready for a PTA meeting. It's embarrassing, really." The entire table fell dead silent. Even Chloe Gable looked mildly horrified. William Royce's face turned entirely to stone. His eyes darted from the smirking, arrogant Carter to the quiet, dignified Naya. The heir to the Sterling Empire, the woman whose family literally owned the building they were currently standing in. "Embarrassing," Royce repeated, the word tasting like acid in his mouth. He looked at Carter with an expression of profound disgust. "Yes, I can see that someone here is certainly an embarrassment." Carter, entirely missing the tone, laughed. "Exactly. Anyway, Mr. Royce, about the Hudson Bay Initiative. I have heard enough, Mr. Wells," Royce said coldly, cutting him off. He turned his back on Carter entirely, bowed his head slightly to Naya, and walked away. Carter stood frozen, confused by the sudden cold shoulder. He turned his fury immediately onto Naya. "What did you do?" he whispered viciously. "Did you glare at him? Did you say something? You ruined it. I told you were going to humiliate me." Naya calmly placed her linen napkin on the table. She stood up. She did not yell. She did not cry. "I didn't do anything, Carter," Naya said, her voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the ballroom. "You did this all by yourself. I stayed because I loved the man I thought you were. But he doesn't exist anymore." "Where are you going?" Carter demanded as she turned away. "Sit down. You are not walking out on me in front of Richard." "I'm going home to pack," Naya said, not looking back. "Enjoy your award, Carter. It's the last thing you'll ever win." When Carter finally returned to the penthouse at 2 a.m., clutching a silver trophy but nursing a massive ego bruise from Royce's snub, the apartment was half empty. Naya's clothes were gone. Her books were gone. The only thing left on the kitchen island was her wedding ring, resting perfectly in the center of a business card. Carter picked it up, scoffing. He fully expected it to be a card for her silly literacy charity. He was already planning how he would make her beg for forgiveness when she inevitably came crawling back. But it wasn't a charity card. It was a thick, matte black card with heavy gold embossing. It read, "Naya Sterling, Executive Vice President, the Sterling Group Global Acquisitions and Corporate Restructuring, Carter stared at the name. Sterling. The Sterling Group. The invisible giants who owned the majority stake in William Royce's fund. The same people who, rumors said, were about to acquire the debt of Harrison and Gable. The silver trophy slipped from Carter's hand, hitting the marble floor with a deafening crack. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, casting harsh, blinding rays over the remnants of Carter Wells's shattered reality. He sat on the edge of the California king bed, still wearing his tuxedo trousers and an unbuttoned dress shirt, staring at the matte black business card resting on his palm. Nia Sterling, Executive Vice President, the Sterling Group. His head pounded with a vicious hangover, but the physical pain was entirely eclipsed by a cold, creeping dread settling into his stomach. For the first 20 minutes, his ego fought a desperate, bloody battle against the facts. "It's a prank," he told himself, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "She had this printed at a kiosk to mess with me. She's a non-profit worker. She clips coupons. She buys generic brand pasta. This is insane." But Carter was a man of the corporate world, and his instincts eventually overrode his denial. He stumbled into his home office, fired up his sleek Mac desktop, and opened a browser. He typed "The Sterling Group" into the search bar. The results were not flashy. There was no gaudy corporate website filled with buzzwords. There was only a minimalist landing page, a Wikipedia article, and a series of dry, intimidating profiles in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. The Sterling Group was a privately held leviathan. They didn't build commercial real estate. They financed the firms that did. They owned international shipping ports, massive tracts of undeveloped land in Silicon Valley, and held majority stakes in 3 different global banking institutions. Carter's hands began to shake as he clicked on an article titled "The Invisible Empire: Inside the Sterling Family Succession." He scrolled past a photo of the fearsome patriarch, Arthur Sterling, a man whose face looked like it was carved from granite, and a photo of his eldest son, Arthur Jr. Carter paused. He recognized Arthur Jr. It was Artie, the guy in the cheap suit who claimed to run a hardware store at his wedding. Carter had shoved him into a corner near the buffet line so he wouldn't embarrass the Harrison and Gable partners. Then Carter scrolled further down. The breath completely left his lungs. It was a rare photograph taken at a private charity gala in Monaco, dated 5 years ago. There she was, Nia. She was wearing a breathtaking, custom emerald green gown, her hair intricately styled, a necklace of flawless canary diamonds resting against her collarbone. The caption read, "Nia Sterling, the elusive youngest daughter, known for her philanthropic pursuits and her controlling voting shares in the Sterling Trust." "Oh my God," Carter whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the vast, sterile space of the penthouse. "Oh my God, it's her." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just married a kind woman. He had married a dynasty. He had spent the last 3 years berating a billionaire heiress for not wearing a $3,000 Gucci belt, while she quietly owned the companies that manufactured the fabric. He had called her embarrassing. He had treated her like a burden. And last night, he had publicly humiliated her in front of William Royce, a man who, Carter now realized with sickening clarity, essentially worked for her father. Panic, raw and unfiltered, took over. Carter grabbed his phone and dialed Nia's number. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been disconnected." He threw the phone against the sofa and grabbed his keys. He drove his Porsche recklessly through the Sunday morning traffic, heading straight for the south side to the youth literacy center Nia ran. He pulled up to the curb, expecting to see the modest, run-down brick building he had always envisioned. Instead, he found a pristine, state-of-the-art community center taking up half the block. The sign out front read, "The Eleanor Sterling Foundation for Youth Development." He rushed the glass doors, but they were locked. A security guard stepped out from a booth, a large, no-nonsense man in a tactical uniform. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, his hand resting casually near his hip. "I need to see Nia. Nia Wells, or Nia Sterling. She runs this place." "I'm her husband," Carter stammered, looking frantic. The guard's expression didn't change. "There is no one here by that name, sir. The facility is closed for the weekend. I'm going to have to ask you to step off the property." Carter drove back to the loop in a daze. The weekend passed in a blur of escalating terror. By the time Monday morning arrived, Carter had convinced himself he could fix this. He was a master negotiator, the deal-maker of the year nominee. He would apologize. He would grovel. He would explain the pressure he was under. Once he got Nia back, his position at the firm wouldn't just be secure. He would be untouchable. He would be the son-in-law of Arthur Sterling. He walked into the offices of Harrison and Gable at 7:30 a.m., dressed in his finest charcoal suit, plastering his signature confident smile onto his face. The bullpen was dead silent. As Carter walked past the glass-walled offices of his colleagues, nobody made eye contact. The men who had clapped him on the back on Friday now stared intently at their monitors. The wives' gossip network had clearly worked overtime. Before Carter could even reach his desk, Richard Gable's executive assistant stepped into his path. "Mr. Gable wants to see you in his office. Immediately." Carter straightened his tie and walked into the massive corner office. Richard Gable, a ruthless man in his 60s who suffered fools poorly, was standing by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. He didn't turn around. "Close the door, Carter." Carter did as he was told. "Richard, if this is about Friday night—" "William Royce pulled his firm's entire portfolio from our management this morning," Gable said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. He finally turned to face Carter, and the absolute fury in the older man's eyes made Carter involuntarily take a step back. $300 million in managed assets, gone. The Hudson Bay Initiative Development Fund, gone. The partnership vote I had lined up for you this afternoon, cancelled. "Richard, please, it was a misunderstanding. Royce overreacted to a personal spat between me and my wife." "A personal spat?" Gable slammed his fist onto his mahogany desk. "Royce called me at 6 o'clock this morning. He didn't cite market conditions. He didn't cite our fee structures. He cited you. He told me that a firm that employs a man of such staggering arrogance, blindness, and profound lack of character is not a firm he trusts with his capital. He called you a liability, Carter." "I can fix it," Carter pleaded, his perfectly curated facade crumbling. "My wife. Richard, my wife is Nia Sterling, of the Sterling Group. If I can just get a meeting with her." Gable looked at Carter as if he were looking at a diseased rat. "I don't know what kind of delusional breakdown you are having, Carter, but the fact that you drove your wife out of that gala in tears is the talk of the entire Chicago elite. You embarrassed this firm. You cost us our biggest client. You are stripped of your senior director title. You are moved to the junior bullpen, and your accounts are being reassigned to Marcus." "You're demoting me?" Carter choked out. The Porsche payments, the massive mortgage on the penthouse, the bespoke tailors. His entire life was leveraged on his senior director salary and the anticipated partner bonuses. "I am showing you mercy by not firing you on the spot because of the legal red tape," Gable sneered. "Get out of my office, and pray you close something minor this quarter, or you won't survive the winter." 50 miles north of the city, shielded by acres of dense, old-growth forest and wrought-iron gates, the Sterling family estate sat in imposing silence. Nia sat in the solarium, a cup of Earl Grey tea resting untouched beside her. She was no longer wearing the vintage silk gown, nor was she wearing her comfortable knit sweaters. She was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored black suit. The armor was back on. The heavy oak doors of the solarium opened, and Arthur Sterling Sr. walked in, accompanied by his son, Arthur Jr. The patriarch of the Sterling family was 70 years old, but he moved with the predatory grace of a much younger man. His eyes, the same piercing, intelligent brown as his daughter's, locked on to her. "I heard about the gala," Arthur Sr. said, his voice a low rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "William called me." Nia didn't flinch. "I handled it, Father. He humiliated you in public," Arthur Jr. snapped, pacing the length of the room. The hardware store owner was now dressed in a Tom Ford suit, looking every bit the ruthless corporate executioner he was known to be on Wall Street. "He treated you like dirt for 3 years while you played house in that ridiculous disguise, Nia. Give me the word. I will have him blacklisted from every real estate firm between New York and Tokyo. I will bury him." "No," Nia said firmly, standing up. "Personal vengeance is sloppy, Artie. It's emotional, and it leaves a mess." Arthur Sr. smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. "Listen to your sister, Junior. We do not operate on emotion. We operate on leverage." He walked over to a side bar and poured himself a glass of sparkling water. "Nia, you asked for the files on Harrison and Gable 6 months ago, when you first started having doubts. Have you reviewed them?" "I have," Nia said, walking over to a mahogany conference table in the center of the room and opening a thick leather dossier. "Harrison and Gable projects an image of invulnerability, but it's entirely smoke and mirrors. Richard Gable has been incredibly aggressive. They are over-leveraged on the Hudson Bay Initiative. They secured a massive line of credit, $150 million, through a regional lender, Vanguard Trust." "Vanguard Trust," Arthur Jr. mused, looking at the documents. "Small, ambitious, susceptible to a buyout." "Exactly," Nia said, her finger tracing the financial diagrams. "If Harrison and Gable loses their anchor investors, which they already have, courtesy of Mr. Royce, they will not be able to meet their quarterly covenants on that loan. If someone were to acquire Vanguard Trust, that someone would essentially own the debt of Harrison and Gable. They would own the building Carter Wells works in. They would own the chair he sits on." Arthur Sr. looked at his daughter with profound pride. "The Sterling Group has been looking to expand our Midwestern commercial debt portfolio. Vanguard Trust seems like a highly strategic acquisition. Don't you agree, Executive Vice President Sterling?" "I do, Mr. Chairman," Nia replied, her eyes cold and focused. "Initiate the buyout quietly. Use the Delaware shell corporations. I want the acquisition finalized within 6 weeks, right around the time Harrison and Gable will be desperate to restructure." Over the next month and a half, Carter Wells's life descended into a claustrophobic nightmare. The demotion at work was absolute. Stripped of his corner office, he was banished to a tiny cubicle near the copy machine. His former subordinates, the same people he used to bark orders at, now gave him pitying looks or openly mocked him. He was completely isolated. But the financial pressure was far worse. Without his senior director salary and the partner bonuses he had already spent in his mind, his cash flow evaporated. He maxed out 3 credit cards trying to maintain the illusion of wealth, terrified that if he sold the Porsche or listed the penthouse, the vultures at the firm would know he was bleeding out. He sent emails to Nia every day. They all bounced back. He hired a private investigator to find her, paying the man an exorbitant retainer. 3 days later, The investigator returned the money in a cashier's check with a typed note. "Stop looking for this woman, or I will report you to the authorities myself. You are out of your depth." Carter was drowning, but he clung to his arrogant belief that he could charm his way out of anything. He just needed one big break, one chance to get back in the room with the decision-makers. That chance seemingly arrived on a rainy Tuesday in early November. Panic was sweeping through the executive floors of Harrison and Gable. Rumors were flying that Vanguard Trust, their primary lender, had been hostilely taken over by a massive, unnamed private equity firm. The new parent company had immediately audited Vanguard's books and flagged Harrison and Gable's massive loan as high risk due to the loss of the Royce account. They had called the debt in. A mandatory restructuring meeting was demanded by the new parent company. They were sending their executive board to the Harrison and Gable offices to determine if the firm would be allowed to restructure or if their assets would be liquidated and sold off for parts. Carter saw his opening. He ambushed Richard Gable in the executive washroom. "Richard, let me in on the restructuring pitch," Carter pleaded, blocking the door. He looked haggard, the dark circles under his eyes betraying weeks of sleepless nights. Gable scoffed, washing his hands. "Are you out of your mind, Wells? You're a junior broker. The people coming today are private equity executioners. They will eat you alive." "I am the best closer you have, and you know it," Carter insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. "I know the Hudson Bay property better than anyone. Let me pitch the asset value to these new bankers. If I can convince them to extend our credit line, you get your firm back, and I get my senior director title reinstated. It's a win-win." Gable dried his hands, slowly, looking at Carter with a mixture of contempt and calculation. Gable was a survivor. He knew the firm was bleeding. If Carter went in and miraculously saved the deal, Gable kept his company. If Carter went in and failed, Gable had the perfect scapegoat to offer the new owners. "Fine," Gable said coldly. "The meeting is at 2 p.m. in the grand boardroom. Wear a suit that doesn't look like you slept in it. And Wells, if you speak out of turn and cost me my firm, I will personally make sure you never work in real estate again, not even leasing studio apartments." Carter practically sprinted back to his cubicle. This was it. The comeback. He spent the next 4 hours obsessively reviewing the Hudson Bay financials, rehearsing his pitch, perfecting his smile, and polishing his armor. He was going to walk into that boardroom, dazzle these faceless private equity bankers, and reclaim his throne. At 1:55 p.m., Carter walked into the grand boardroom. Richard Gable and the remaining senior partners were already seated, looking uncharacteristically nervous. At precisely 2 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Carter stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, flashing his most brilliant, confident, million-dollar smile toward the doorway. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "On behalf of Harrison and Gable, we welcome you to—" The words died in his throat. The smile slid off his face, replaced by an expression of absolute, paralyzing horror. A team of elite corporate lawyers filed into the room first, taking their seats silently on the opposite side of the table. Then came Arthur Jr., wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Carter's car, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. And finally, walking into the room with the quiet, devastating authority of a monarch, was the executive vice president of the new parent company. Naya. The grand boardroom of Harrison and Gable, usually a theater of loud voices and aggressive posturing, was reduced to a suffocating, absolute silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, agonizingly slow ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Carter's legs turned to lead. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The meticulously rehearsed pitch about the Hudson Bay Initiative evaporated from his brain, replaced by a roaring static. Nia did not look at him. She didn't glare, she didn't smirk, and she certainly didn't offer a dramatic gasp of recognition. She simply walked to the head of the table opposite Richard Gable, her posture impossibly straight, and took her seat. Arthur Jr. sat to her right, opening his briefcase and arranging a series of thick, legally binding documents on the polished mahogany. The Sterling legal team flanked them like a phalanx of silent, well-tailored assassins. Richard Gable, completely unaware of the nuclear bomb, sitting at the other end of the table, stood up and offered a practiced, deferential smile. He had spent his life reading power, and he instantly recognized that the woman sitting across from him possessed it in staggering quantities. "Good afternoon," Gable said smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "We were informed that the executive board of our new parent company would be arriving. I am Richard Gable, CEO. To whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" Nia folded her hands on the table. "I am Nia Sterling, Executive Vice President of the Sterling Group. We finalized the acquisition of Vanguard Trust 48 hours ago. Sitting to my right is Arthur Sterling Jr., Head of Acquisitions." A ripple of genuine shock passed through the Horrison and Gable partners. The Sterling Group wasn't just a private equity firm, it was a financial leviathan. They didn't just play the game, they owned the board. Gable's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Mr. Sterling." "It is an honor," Gable said, his voice dropping a register to project respect. "We were a bit blindsided by the sudden call for restructuring, but I assure you, Harrison and Gable remains a highly profitable—" "Save the preamble, Mr. Gable," Nia interrupted. Her voice was like liquid nitrogen. "I am not here for a sales pitch. I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing your books. You are grossly over-leveraged. The Hudson Bay Initiative is a disaster waiting to happen, and your primary anchor investor, William Royce, pulled out last week because of a profound lack of confidence in your firm's judgment." Gable swallowed hard. He cast a desperate, furious glance at Carter, who was still standing by the projector, looking like a man facing a firing squad. "We have a plan to rectify that," Gable said hastily. "In fact, I have brought my best closer to present the asset value of the Hudson Bay project to you today. Carter, step up." Carter felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The nightmare was real. He looked at Nia, his eyes pleading, begging for a lifeline, a shred of the soft, forgiving woman who used to make him chamomile tea. "Nia," Carter whispered, his voice cracking. He took a pathetic step forward. "Nia, honey, please, let's just talk about this. I can explain everything. I was stressed. I was—" "Mr. Wells," Nia said, cutting him off with a surgical strike. The complete absence of emotion in her voice was far more terrifying than if she had screamed. "You will address me as Ms. Sterling, and unless you have a financial model that can miraculously conjure $300 million out of thin air, you will take your seat and remain silent. We are on a very tight schedule." Gable's head snapped toward Carter, his eyes wide with a horrified realization. He looked from Carter to the billionaire heiress sitting across the table, and the puzzle pieces crashed together. Carter's wife, the woman at the gala, the spat that made William Royce pull his funding. "Carter," Gable hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Are you—" Arthur Jr. leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He offered Gable a shark-like grin. "Oh yes, Mr. Gable. Your junior broker here was married to my sister. He spent the last 3 years living in an apartment we owned, driving a car subsidized by a salary we essentially financed, all while berating her for not looking rich enough for your company dinners. a true visionary of asset management. A collective gasp echoed from the senior partners. Carter shrank back into his chair, physically attempting to make himself smaller. The meticulously crafted armor he had spent years building was being peeled off him, strip by strip, in front of the very men he worshipped. As I was saying, Naya continued seamlessly, as if Carter were nothing more than a stain on the carpet. Your firm is bleeding, Mr. Gable. You have toxic assets, your client retention is plummeting, and your judgment in personnel is, frankly, appalling. You approved the Hudson Bay loans based on fabricated projections. They were not fabricated, Carter blurted out, a sudden, desperate surge of defensive arrogance taking over. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at the documents. Those models are solid. The waterfront development will yield a 20% return by year 3. You can't just come in here and... Turn to page 42 of the dossier in front of you, Mr. Wells, Naya commanded, not even looking at him. Carter scrambled with the leather folder, his hands trembling violently as he flipped to the page. Look at the zoning permits you factored into your year 2 revenue projections, Naya instructed coldly. You assumed commercial rezoning for the south sector. Did you bother to check who owns the Historical Society block, sitting directly in the center of that sector? Carter stared at the paper. The text blurred together. The Sterling Trust owns it, Arthur Jr. said helpfully, leaning back in his chair. And we have absolutely no intention of selling or rezoning, which means your 20% return is mathematically impossible. Your model isn't just aggressive, Wells. It's fiction. Carter's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked at Gable, expecting his boss to back him up, but Gable was looking at Neuer with sheer terror. Ms. Sterling, Gable stammered, abandoning Carter entirely. We can adjust the models. We can restructure the debt. We will do whatever is necessary to keep this firm solvent. Tell us your terms. Naya finally leaned back, resting her hands on the armrests of her chair. She looked at Richard Gable with the cold calculation of an apex predator. The Sterling Group will extend your credit line for an additional 12 months, averting immediate bankruptcy, Nia stated. In exchange, we demand a 60% controlling stake in Harrison and Gable. We take 2 seats on your board. We will dictate your new client acquisition strategy. Gable blanched. 60%? You're taking my company. I am saving your company from the liquidation it deserves, Naya corrected him sharply. You can walk out of this room with 40% of a profitable firm, or 100% of ashes. Make your choice, Richard. Gable looked around the table at his partners. They all nodded furiously. They wanted to survive. We accept your terms, Ms. Sterling, Gable said, his voice defeated. Excellent, Nia said, standing up. The legal team instantly mirrored her movement. Arthur will forward the transitional contracts by end of day. Oh, and Mr. Gable, there is one final stipulation regarding the restructuring of your personnel. Carter felt all the blood drain from his face. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Naya finally turned her gaze directly onto Carter. The power dynamic was so absolute, so overwhelmingly one-sided, that Carter felt physically sick. He remembered the night he yelled at her about the pink dress. He remembered telling her she was an embarrassment. He had thought he was a king, but he was just a jester playing in her castle. Your firm carries significant dead weight, Naya told Gable, while keeping her eyes locked on Carter. I require you to immediately terminate any employees who have proven to be a liability to client relations and financial forecasting. We do not tolerate incompetence, and we certainly do not tolerate arrogance masking incompetence. Gable didn't even hesitate. Survival instincts kicked in. He looked directly at Carter. Carter, Gable said, his voice dripping with venom. You are fired, effective immediately. You will not receive severance. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items, and then you will be removed from the premises." Carter's world completely collapsed. "Richard, please, you can't do this. I brought in the Miller account. I worked 80-hour weeks for this firm." He turned to Nia, tears actually springing to his eyes, his pride utterly broken. "Nia, please, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I love you. Don't do this to me." Nia picked up her briefcase. She looked at the groveling, broken man weeping in his $10,000 suit. She felt no triumph, no joyful vindication. She just felt exhausted by how small he truly was. "You don't love me, Carter," Nia said, quietly, her voice echoing in the silent room. "You love this room. You love the reflection of yourself in this glass. And now, you don't even have that." She turned and walked out the double oak doors, followed closely by her brother and her legal team. She never looked back. The fall of Carter Wells was swift, brutal, and totally unceremonious. 2 massive security guards marched him down to the junior bullpen. In front of all the colleagues he had once bossed around, Carter was forced to pack a small cardboard box with his stapler, a few framed photos he had bought to look established, and his coffee mug. No one offered sympathy. The gossip of what happened in the boardroom had already spread like wildfire. They looked at him like he was a ghost. By the time he carried his box out to the parking garage, his keycard had been deactivated. When Carter returned to his penthouse, the reality of his financial house of cards began to cave in. Without his corporate income, he couldn't cover the astronomical mortgage. He tried to reach out to his network, the other brokers, the wealthy clients he had dined with. Every single one of his calls went straight to voicemail. Word had gotten out that he was the man who had personally insulted the Sterling dynasty. In the cutthroat world of Chicago, real estate, crossing the Sterling family, was corporate suicide. Carter was entirely, hopelessly radioactive. Within 3 weeks, the repo men arrived for the Porsche. Carter stood on the sidewalk in the pouring rain, watching his symbol of success being towed away, clutching an umbrella he had stolen from a hotel lobby. 2 months later, the bank foreclosed on the penthouse. Carter was forced to liquidate his bespoke suits, his luxury watches, and his expensive shoes just to afford the security deposit on a dismal, cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood he used to mock. 6 months passed. The harsh Chicago winter had settled over the city. In a dingy, fluorescent-lit strip mall on the outskirts of the city limits, Carter sat behind a cheap particleboard desk. He was wearing an off-the-rack polyester suit that didn't quite fit, his hair thinning from the relentless stress. He was working at a low-tier leasing agency, desperately trying to convince college students to rent overpriced, bug-infested apartments. He was eating a bowl of generic brand microwave pasta for lunch when a co-worker tossed a magazine onto his desk. "Hey Wells, did you see this?" the co-worker mumbled, chewing gum loudly. Crazy money out there. Carter looked down at the cover of Forbes magazine. Staring back at him was Nia. She looked breathtaking. She was wearing a simple, elegant navy silk blazer, unbranded, understated, and radiating absolute power. The headline beneath her photo read in bold gold lettering, "The New Architect of Power, How Nia Sterling Remade. The Sterling Group and Conquered the Midwest." Carter stared at the photograph for a long time. The pasta cooled and congealed in its plastic bowl. He reached out and lightly touched the glossy cover. He thought about the quiet, brilliant woman who had loved him unconditionally, who had offered him a life of genuine peace and unimaginable security, and how he had thrown it all away because he was too blind to see its value. He had called a queen an embarrassment, solely because she refused to wear the plastic crown he demanded. Carter closed the magazine, pushed it into his trash can, and picked up his headset to dial the next angry landlord. The silence of his tiny office was deafening, a permanent reminder of the empire he had burned to the ground. And that is the brutal, undeniable truth about chasing illusions. When you value the price tag over the person, you will eventually bankrupt your own life. Carter Wells learned the hard way that true wealth doesn't scream for attention. It sits quietly in the corner, observing, until it's time to own the entire room. He let his ego and his obsession with appearances blind him to the incredible woman he had right in front of him. And in the end, that blinding arrogance cost him his career, his status, and his future. If this story of karma, secret billionaires, and the ultimate boardroom revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a massive plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life drama stories every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Naya in that boardroom? See you in the next one.